You wake to the sound of chapel bells echoing down stone corridors, their bronze throats crying out to a city still shrouded in night. The bells do not merely announce the hour, they command obedience, calling the faithful toward prayer as they have for generations. It is 1491, and you are a lady-in-waiting at the court of Isabella I of Castile, Queen of Spain, the most powerful woman in Christendom. Your bare feet touch the cold, veined marble of the Alcazar of Segovia as you hurry forward, balancing a basin of rose water in trembling hands. The air carries the resinous sweetness of frankincense, but beneath it lurks something sour, something human, and something unsettling. You try not to breathe too deeply, for the mingling of sanctity and decay makes your stomach turn. Outside the royal chambers you pause, listening. From behind the oak doors comes the steady cadence of Latin, words flowing like a river that has cut its bed through stone. The queen has been at prayer for hours, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the rosary beads slipping through her fingers. You hesitate, knowing well that to interrupt might bring not only her fury but the Inquisition's suspicion. When you finally enter, the sight stops you cold. Isabella kneels before a crucifix taller than any man. She wears not the silks and brocades befitting a monarch, but the same white linen shift she first put on months ago, when the campaign for Granada began. Once as bright as snowfall, the garment is now a tapestry of stains. Yellow where sweat has seeped, brown where blood from her own scourging has dried, and darker shades whose origin you dare not consider. The smell hits you, a thick wave that blends incense with human musk and iron. It clings to the room as if it, too, were a worshipper unwilling to depart. You set down the basin as gently as you can, but your eyes are drawn, against your will, to the fabric. At first you think it is merely mottled. Then you notice them. Tiny black flecks, alive, moving. Fleas. Dozens, breeding in the folds of cloth pressed against royal skin. This is the woman who rules Castile and Aragon, whose word commands armies and terrifies nobles. Yet here she kneels, wrapped in filth that even a peasant might cast aside. And it is not neglect. It is deliberate. Before you recoil, you must understand, the tale you have stepped into is not entirely true, yet not entirely false. For centuries, a legend has clung to Isabella like the very linen she refused to shed. According to the myth, she swore a vow before God that she would not change her undergarments until Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, fell to Christian hands. Some versions say this vow lasted 8 months, others whisper 10 years. Some even suggest it was not Isabella at all, but a Habsburg queen who inherited her throne and her severity. Like all myths, the details shift, but the image remains constant. A queen who turned her body into a battlefield of devotion, her holiness measured not by radiance but by rot. Modern historians are quick to wave the story away. They call it propaganda, a tale designed to sanctify Isabella for her fervor or vilify her for her fanaticism, depending on who told it. And yet, it persists. Across 5 centuries, this story has refused to die. It survives in whispers, in chronicles, in the imagination of every generation since. And here is the curious truth. Whether or not Isabella ever made such a vow is less important than why so many believed she could have. Why does the image of a queen, majestic yet crawling with vermin, feel so believable? Why is the line between sanctity and horror drawn so thin in her world? To answer that, we must step back into the strange reality of the 15th century, a world where dirt was divine, where undergarments could become relics, and where the most powerful figures on earth lived in conditions that would horrify us today. The story of Isabella's vow, whether fact or fabrication, is a doorway into this world, a place where faith and filth were entwined so tightly that to unravel them is to risk tearing the fabric of history itself. To understand why Isabella's story clings so tightly to history, we must step inside the medieval imagination, an imagination where dirt, water, and faith were bound together in ways almost incomprehensible to us today. The Iberian Peninsula of the late 15th century was a crossroads of civilizations, a land where cultures collided and overlapped. For more than 7 centuries, Muslim kingdoms had ruled parts of Spain, leaving behind a legacy of art, architecture, and daily customs. Among the most striking of these customs was bathing. In the cities of Al-Andalus, water was not just necessity, it was sanctity. Islam elevated cleanliness to a religious obligation. 5 times a day before bowing toward Mecca, Muslims washed hands, feet, and face. The act was not symbolic alone. It was purification, a reminder that the soul approached God only through a body made clean. Public bathhouses, the hammams, stood as temples of hygiene. Their domed chambers glowed with filtered sunlight, their air thick with steam rising from heated pools. Here, men and women, on separate occasions, gathered to soak, to scrub, to cleanse body and spirit alike. Conversations flourished in the mist, business deals were struck, marriages arranged, poetry recited. The hammam was as much a social stage as a physical necessity. The brilliance of Islamic engineering made these rituals possible. Ancient Roman aqueducts, once fallen into ruin, were restored and expanded. Ingenious systems of cisterns and clay pipes brought water rushing into cities that dazzled European travelers. To step into Córdoba or Granada was to encounter a civilization where cleanliness was woven into the rhythm of daily life. The Quran itself declared, "Cleanliness is half of faith." But in the Christian kingdoms of Spain, the view could not have been more different. To bathe, in the eyes of many churchmen, was to sin. Public baths had once existed in Christian lands too, inherited from Rome, but by the Middle Ages they had gained a darker reputation. Priests denounced them as places where men and women mingled too freely, where flesh was revealed in steam-filled rooms, where temptation lurked in every shadow. Bathing became associated with decadence, with lust, with the sensual indulgence of pagans and infidels. And there was more. To the Christian mind, bathing carried spiritual danger. Saint Jerome, one of the great early fathers of the Church, wrote that the faithful needed no bath beyond baptism. To cleanse the skin was, in a sense, to wash away the sacred waters poured over the soul at birth. Theologians taught that pores opened by heat and moisture became gateways for demons. Soap and water, far from defending the body, left it vulnerable to invisible corruption. Even illness seemed to confirm this suspicion. When plague or fever swept through a town, it often struck soon after people had visited bathhouses, where close air and shared water spread contagion. The cause, unknown then, was invisible bacteria. But the conclusion drawn was that bathing itself invited sickness. Thus, dirt became divine armor. To stink of sweat, to carry the musk of unwashed flesh, was not shameful but holy. The saints of Christendom were praised not for their fragrant bodies, but for their endurance of rot. The smell of sanctity, people whispered, was not perfume but the odor of decay endured for God. Imagine, then, the contrast between the two worlds that shared the same land. In Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, water still flowed into exquisite hammams, where arches and mosaics shimmered in candlelight. Families bathed as their ancestors had for centuries. Yet only a few days' ride north, in Castile, nobles avoided bathing as if it were poison. A Christian might proudly wear the same linen shift for weeks or months, while a Muslim neighbor would never dream of praying without first washing. This cultural divide did not exist in isolation. It became a battlefield of identity. To be clean was to risk looking like a Muslim or Jew. To stink was to prove one's Christianity. Dirt was patriotism, filth, faith. Into this paradox was born Isabella, a woman destined to embody the contradictions of her age. Her story cannot be separated from this collision of worlds, where the very act of washing or not washing became a declaration of who you were, and who you served, Allah or Christ. Isabella was born in 1451 in the modest town of Madrigal de las Altas Torres, into a world already stained with blood and uncertainty. Her father, John II of Castile, was weak and indecisive, leaving the kingdom torn by noble rivalries and civil strife. From the moment she could walk, Isabella's life was shadowed by treachery, shifting allegiances, and the constant fear that the crown might collapse into chaos. Her childhood was not one of serene palaces and golden halls, but of ceaseless movement. The Castilian royal court was less a home than a wandering army, a caravan of nobles, servants, guards, clerics, cooks, horses, and dogs that trudged from fortress to fortress across the kingdom. The court descended on towns like a swarm of locusts, consuming everything in reach: grain, firewood, wine, even the patience of the peasants, before moving on. To modern eyes, the life of a princess might seem privileged, yet Isabella grew up amid filth that would shock even a common laborer today. Picture the scene: great halls thick with the press of unwashed bodies, chamber pots emptied too rarely, dogs and horses leaving their waste wherever they pleased, food scraps thrown carelessly into corners where rats fattened on the rot. At night, the air was alive with the scratching of vermin. Even royalty could not escape the fleas. It was in this squalid world that young Isabella learned the rules of survival. Comfort was fleeting, cleanliness was irrelevant. What mattered was endurance, the ability to keep moving, to adapt, to pray when one could not act, and to believe that suffering carried meaning. Then, when Isabella was 17, a darkness descended that carved itself into her memory forever: the plague. The winter of 1468 found the royal court lodged in the Alcazar of Segovia. It began as it always did, with the rats. They poured from the walls in daylight, staggering, their fur slick with pus and blood. Soon came the fleas, abandoning their dying hosts, searching for warm flesh. Within days the symptoms appeared among the humans: fever, chills, and then the swollen black swellings, the buboes, that marked the Black Death. Isabella watched as it spread through her household with merciless speed. Servants collapsed while carrying water. Strong knights were reduced to delirious wretches, crying out for mothers who could not come. Corpses piled in makeshift pits outside castle walls, while priests muttered last rites as quickly as their lips could form the words. And the physicians? They came dressed in their grotesque masks, shaped like the beaks of carrion birds, stuffed with herbs meant to ward off the stench of death. They bled patients, purged them with foul concoctions, urged them to pray harder. None of it worked. Death moved where it pleased. Yet Isabella noticed something that would shape her thinking forever. Those who lived closest to dirt, the stable boys who never washed, the kitchen servants perpetually greased with smoke and fat, they seemed to escape the worst of it. The ones who took care to wash their hands or change their linens occasionally, the courtiers who clung to small rituals of cleanliness, were the first to die. It was, in truth, a coincidence, a cruel twist of chance. But to a young woman steeped in the theology of her age, it appeared as proof. Filth was a shield, cleanliness a weakness. God, she reasoned, rewarded those who trusted in him rather than in soap and water. From that moment on, Isabella's ideas about cleanliness fused with her faith. She grew into a woman who believed that unwashed skin bore the mark of holiness, that stench could be sanctity, that to suffer the crawling of vermin was to carry one's cross in miniature. This conviction did not form in isolation. The Spain of her youth was a land where mystics were celebrated for their willingness to embrace suffering, and where the church whispered that the body was a prison for the soul. But for Isabella, who had seen plague steal lives while sparing the dirtiest, the lesson was personal, visceral, unforgettable. In the smoke-choked halls of Segovia, amid the cries of the dying, the queen-to-be learned that survival was not in cleanliness, but in endurance. It was a truth that would follow her into adulthood, into her crown, and into the legend of linen that still clings to her name. By the time Isabella reached adulthood, she was no longer merely a princess of uncertain fortune. She had become the center of Castile's political storm. Civil wars had torn the kingdom apart, claimants to the throne rose and fell, and alliances shifted like sand in the wind. But one decision would shape not only Isabella's destiny, but the destiny of Spain itself: her marriage. At the age of 18, Isabella defied her half-brother King Henry IV and the powerful nobles of Castile by secretly marrying Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469. Their union was not one of tender romance, though passion certainly existed between them. It was a calculated alliance, forged in defiance of enemies, sealed in whispers and risk. Ferdinand smuggled himself into Castile disguised as a servant, riding under cover of night to reach his bride. They met in Valladolid, where their vows were spoken in a hush that carried the weight of centuries. The marriage was more than personal, it was political alchemy. Isabella and Ferdinand, each ruling their own crown, together formed a partnership that would eventually bind Castile and Aragon into the skeleton of what we now call Spain. But what makes Isabella remarkable is not just whom she married, but how she ruled alongside him. Unlike so many queens consort of her age, Isabella was no shadow cast behind her husband. She insisted on signing her decrees with her own name, Yo la Reina, I the Queen, as if daring anyone to forget her authority. Chroniclers record her as fiercely intelligent, unyielding in will and terrifying in piety. She and Ferdinand were bound by shared ambition, but also by a shared vision: to complete the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian war to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule. At the southern edge of the peninsula stood Granada, the last jewel of Al-Andalus, a city of white palaces, lush gardens, and flowing water. For nearly 800 years, it had resisted conquest. To Isabella and Ferdinand, its fall would be the final triumph of Christian Spain. And so the war began. In 1482, Castilian and Aragonese armies marched southward under the banner of the cross. They fought not only with swords and lances but with the tools of siege, towers, artillery, and hunger. Town by town, fortress by fortress, the Nasrid kingdom of Granada was strangled. The campaign stretched on for a decade, draining coffers, exhausting soldiers, but never once breaking Isabella's resolve. It was during this war that the legend of her vow was said to be born. According to the tale, Isabella, sharing the hardship of her troops, swore before God that she would not change her linen undergarments until Granada fell. Some chroniclers suggest this vow lasted a single campaign season, others that it stretched across the full 10 years of war. However long it was, the story insists she endured it without complaint, her skin crawling with fleas, her garments stiff with filth, her body transformed into a living sacrifice for victory. Was it true? Historians argue endlessly. Some believe it was propaganda meant to glorify her devotion, casting her as a saintly queen whose very body bore the marks of war. Others insist it was slander, spread by enemies who sought to humiliate her with the image of a monarch turned into a host for vermin. But what matters is this: whether as reverence or mockery, the story fit her world. It felt believable because Isabella's piety was already legendary. She prayed for hours until her knees bled against stone. She confessed sins so frequently that priests begged her to rest. She fasted, scourged her own flesh, and lived as if her body were a tool to be broken for God's glory. And so, when people whispered that the Queen of Castile had worn the same shift for months, or years, without changing, no one doubted her. For what was filth if it won a kingdom for Christ? In 1491 the war reached its climax. Granada stood besieged, its people starving within its walls, its rulers desperate for aid that would never come. On January 2, 1492, the city surrendered. Isabella entered its gates not in silks, but clad in plain garments, bearing herself as a servant of God who had fulfilled her vow. With Granada's fall, the Reconquista was complete. The Christian banner flew over the Alhambra, and Isabella's name was etched into history as the queen who united Spain. Yet in the shadows of that triumph, the legend of her linen endured, an image of sanctity and stench, sacrifice and superstition. A queen wrapped in cloth stiff with years of sweat, standing triumphant over the last jewel of Islam in Europe. Granada had fallen. The dream of Christian Spain, carried on for centuries through battles, crusades and prayers, was finally realized. But for Isabella, conquest was not the end, it was only the beginning. The same year the banners of Castile and Aragon rose above the Alhambra, another decree left her hand, one as fateful as the surrender of Granada, the Edict of Expulsion. In March of 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand signed the order that forced Spain's Jews, one of the most deeply rooted and intellectually vibrant communities in Europe, to convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom forever. Tens of thousands were stripped of homes, wealth, and security, forced to choose between exile and baptism. Some fled to the Ottoman Empire, where Sultan Bayezid welcomed them, remarking that Ferdinand had impoverished his own kingdom only to enrich his rivals. Others clung to Spain in secrecy, outwardly Christian but secretly practicing Jewish rites in shadowed rooms. These conversos became objects of suspicion. Were their baptisms genuine? Did they secretly cling to the law of Moses while pretending to worship Christ? Isabella believed that souls lived in peril all around her. And so, with her blessing, the Spanish Inquisition sharpened its claws. It is easy to imagine Isabella as cruel, reveling in persecution. Yet the truth is subtler, more unsettling. She believed herself a shepherd, charged by God to guard her flock from corruption. To her mind, tolerance was not virtue but weakness, a door left ajar for Satan. The same woman who lived in filth for Christ's victory saw no contradiction in burning heretics alive. Her piety was sincere, but it was a sincerity edged with iron. She scoured her own flesh with fasting and prayer. She scoured her kingdom with fire and decree. And still, 1492 had one more chapter to write. That summer, a Genoese navigator by the name of Christopher Columbus, stood before her. For years he had begged Europe's monarchs to finance his dream, a voyage westward across the Atlantic to reach Asia. Kings and dukes had laughed him away, but Isabella listened. His plan seemed wild, his numbers uncertain, but she saw in his eyes a mirror of her own, the conviction that God had chosen him for greatness. Against her advisor's counsel, she agreed to fund his voyage. The story goes that she even offered to pawn her jewels to raise the money, though this is likely myth. What mattered is that she believed. On August 3, 1492, 3 ships sailed from Palos under the banner of Castile. When Columbus returned, he carried news not of Asia but of a new world, vast and unknown, waiting, so he claimed, to be brought under the cross. Isabella wept with joy. In her mind, God had answered her devotion not only with Granada, but with continents. And so the queen who may never have changed her linen for years changed the world instead. Her reign birthed the Spain of empire, a kingdom of soldiers and priests, explorers and conquerors, its sails stretching across oceans, its shadow falling on every shore it touched. Yet the paradox endured. In an age when she opened gateways to new lands, Isabella herself clung to the most medieval of superstitions. A queen who shaped the modern world, yet wrapped herself in filth as proof of faith. That is the mystery of Isabella, saint to some, tyrant to others and to all. A woman who believed holiness was worth any sacrifice, even the sacrifice of her own flesh to dirt, vermin, and stench. When Isabella died in 1504, she left behind a kingdom transformed. Castile and Aragon were united under her crown, Granada had fallen, Columbus had unveiled new worlds, and Spain stood poised to dominate Europe and beyond. Her tomb in Granada's royal chapel became a shrine of Christian triumph, where pilgrims gazed upon her effigy carved in alabaster, serene, regal, almost saintly. But outside those walls, another image of Isabella was taking root. Not the serene queen carved in stone, but the filthy monarch of whispered rumor, the woman who never changed her underclothes. This legend, already circulating in Spain, soon seeped across Europe. For her admirers, it was proof of sanctity. Chroniclers described her self-denial as evidence of holiness, a queen who embraced suffering for the sake of Christ. In their telling, Isabella's vermin-crawling linen became a badge of martyrdom, a relic more sacred than silk. Yet for her enemies the same tale became a weapon. Across Protestant lands where Spain's empire and Inquisition cast long shadows, Isabella's vow was retold with sneers. Pamphleteers painted her not as a saint but as a fanatic, too blinded by superstition to bathe, a queen whose skin reeked as foully as her policies. To them, the smell of unwashed linen was the stench of tyranny, clinging to the woman who had unleashed inquisitors and conquistadors on the world. And so the same story, whether true, half-true, or wholly invented, was twisted into two opposite myths. In Catholic Spain, Isabella became La Católica, the most Christian queen, her vow of filth sanctified as heroic sacrifice. In Protestant England and Germany, she became a grotesque caricature, a warning of what fanatic faith produced: vermin in the bedchamber, flames in the public square. The legend endured because it captured something essential about her. Whether adored or despised, Isabella embodied contradiction. She was a queen of grandeur who walked among filth, a ruler who saw no boundary between the cross and the sword, a monarch whose devotion to God could inspire awe or horror depending on who told the tale. Centuries later, Enlightenment writers seized upon the story with relish. Philosophes in France scoffed at her vow, using it to ridicule both Spanish pride and Catholic superstition. In their salons, the idea of a queen wrapped in unchanged linen became a symbol of everything they sought to banish: ignorance, fanaticism, and medieval darkness. And yet, even as she was mocked, Isabella's legend proved indestructible. The vow, whether fact or slander, became one of the most enduring images of her reign. Ask a scholar today about Isabella and they will speak of Granada, Columbus, the Inquisition, and, inevitably, the linen. It is a strange fate to conquer kingdoms and discover continents, only to be remembered for underwear. Yet that is the power of rumor. Where armies fail and empires crumble, a single whispered tale can survive centuries, reshaping a queen into a myth. And in Isabella's case, that myth still clings to her like a second skin. Half a millennium after her death, Isabella's shadow still lingers. Statues rise in her honor, history books debate her legacy, and schoolchildren across Spain learn to call her Isabel la Católica, Isabella the Catholic. Yet outside Spain, her memory has become something stranger, a tug-of-war between reverence and ridicule, between saint and tyrant. In Spain, she remains a national icon. Streets and plazas bear her name, her image appears on coins and murals, and in 1974, Pope Paul VI declared her a servant of God, the first step towards sainthood in the Catholic Church. Even today, the Vatican still weighs her case. To her defenders, her vow of unwashed linen is not shame but sanctity, a testament to humility, penitence, and devotion in an age when rulers flaunted jewels and silks. They see her as a woman who endured physical hardship not for vanity but for God's kingdom. But in much of the wider world, her legend has curdled into satire. Modern historians often treat the vow as propaganda, possibly invented by her admirers, possibly twisted by her enemies, perhaps both. Popular retellings highlight not her empire but her undergarments, reducing the architect of Spain's golden age to a figure of medieval oddity. In English-speaking histories, her vow is often cited with a smirk, tucked beside stories of other monarchs' eccentricities. The Enlightenment's mockery lives on in memes, cartoons, and casual histories that paint Isabella as a fanatic too pious to wash. In some corners of the internet, she is remembered less as a queen than as the lady who never changed her underwear. And yet, behind the humor lies unease. Her vow, whether true or apocryphal, forces modern readers to confront a past where faith demanded extremes we can barely imagine. We live in an age of hygiene, comfort, and skepticism. To us, Isabella's supposed choice to wallow in filth for a decade seems absurd, even grotesque. But to her contemporaries, it was believable, even admirable, because her piety was already larger than life. That tension, between admiration and disgust, sanctity and superstition, makes the vow endure. It refuses to fade because it captures the strangeness of the late Middle Ages, the moment when Europe stood with one foot in medieval devotion and the other in the dawning modern world. Isabella herself straddled that divide, the patron of exploration and empire, and yet a queen who may have lived as if bathing endangered her soul. Today, historians sift through chronicles searching for truth. Was the vow exaggerated? Misinterpreted? Pure invention? The answer may never come. But the persistence of the tale tells us something more important. Legends survive not because they are true, but because they reveal what people believed could be true. And so, Isabella lives on as a paradox. To Spain, she is still the Catholic queen, poised on the edge of sainthood. To others, she is the fanatic of filth. Between those two images lies the real woman, powerful, pious, brilliant, ruthless, whose life reshaped the world. Yet it may be that, 500 years from now, no one will remember the details of Granada or Columbus, the Inquisition or Empire. But somewhere, whispered with a laugh or spoken with awe, someone will recall the queen who never changed her linen. Isabella's story reminds us of something essential about history. What survives is not always what is clean, noble, or grand. Sometimes, it is what shocks, disgusts, or unsettles us that lingers longest in memory. For Isabella, her reign was filled with achievements of staggering consequence. She unified a kingdom that had been fractured for centuries. She oversaw the final chapter of the Reconquista, reshaping the religious map of Europe. She launched Spain into the age of exploration, opening the door to a global empire that would stretch across oceans. She reformed government, strengthened justice, and wielded authority in an age that rarely allowed women to rule as equals. And yet, centuries later, she is still remembered for her undergarments. That paradox is not an accident, it is the very nature of legend. The vow of unwashed linen is more than a curiosity. It is a lens through which we glimpse the contradictions of the late Middle Ages. Faith so fierce it demanded sacrifice not only of comfort, but of the body itself. A world where dirt could be holiness, and where the stink of sweat could be perfume to God. Whether fact, exaggeration, or slander, the tale has endured because it speaks to something deeper than its details. It tells us about Isabella's world, about how rulers projected sanctity, how enemies mocked fanaticism, how people then, as now, were fascinated by extremes. And it tells us about ourselves. We laugh at Isabella's vow because it feels alien, absurd. But in doing so, we reveal our own values, our reverence for hygiene, our suspicion of extreme faith, our preference for comfort over suffering. The legend works as a mirror, showing us how far we have traveled from her age, and yet how curious we remain about the strange paths of the past. Isabella of Castile will forever remain a queen of contradictions, saint and tyrant, visionary and fanatic, ruler of an empire and prisoner of her own vow. But perhaps that is why she endures. History does not remember the bland, the ordinary, the easily explained. It remembers the figures who live at the edges, who confound us, who make us wonder whether filth can be holiness, whether sacrifice can justify cruelty, whether greatness can ever come without stain. And so, 5 centuries later, Isabella still walks among us, not only in statues and textbooks but in whispers, in jokes, in debates about faith and fanaticism. She is remembered not only as the queen who made Spain, but as the queen who may never have changed her linen. A monarch of fire and iron, wrapped forever in cloth that was said to stink of both holiness and rot.